Oh, so,
Sorry.
all right, can the folks who are on the phone hear us? Jen, Kat? Perfect, I saw head nods, cool. All right, well, we will kick off the fourth step advisory meeting. We've got a pretty packed agenda, so the main focus for today is we're gonna recap a little bit of what we heard in the previous, because we didn't really get a chance to talk about what we heard from our panel presenters. That was a really good discussion, it went kind of long, and but it was because we were getting so much good information. The bulk of the meeting will be looking at what the actual deliverable is for council, which is a recommendation memorandum that looks at development standards, it looks at city processes for permitting step housing. There's also some information on, potential template for good neighbor agreements. And then there is a little bit about just community outreach in general. I think what we've heard through this process is community engagement, some proactive materials and things that we can provide to the community are a good thing to include. So what some of that might look like. And then we also do have, as part of this advisory committee, a public open house event. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end too. So good packed agenda. The structure, what you'll see in a little bit is we'll talk a little bit about, for each of those things that I mentioned, we'll talk about what the city currently does. Then we'll talk about some things that surrounding cities have done or similar type processes. And then I'll ask a couple of questions about how we can kind of draft, because what we're going to do basically is take the information we get and try and draft some of those things. So draft some development standards, look at the city's processes for approvals, and then also draft a sample good neighbor agreement, and then look at some community outreach material. So we'll try and pull those together for the next meeting to then have you all review. Cool. So we will go ahead and get started. So I'll open it up right away since I don't have like a title slide for this one, but does anybody have any thoughts on the panel discussion that we had last meeting, on the speakers that we had, the information they provided? There was a lot of really good discussion, but anything stick out that you think would be something we want to make sure we highlight as part of this process? To anyone, I know we covered a lot, so it's kind of
there were a number of really great recommendations on minimum capacity size, and where funding is actually connective. There's a difference there. Safety and security features and what helps make a healthy place, whether it has a additional counseling settings or a medical setting that's on site where people can come to, professionals can come to provide that service.
Yeah.
So I think those are things that our community would care about. And the difference between that family level versus the permanent housing, some of those different solutions, security access, remote access.
related to like the different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
passes for the elevator, who's gaining access to the building and then why they do that. I think those are really key issues that many people don't understand that are just part of the matrix there. And I apologize.
No, okay. So some of the intricacies of how these developments work on a day-to-day, just having some of that information is useful.
Yeah, I do think so.
I just want to echo, I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was, if everyone hasn't watched it yet, it was just beautiful and worth the watch. I also, to echo what Karina said, appreciated that, yes, sometimes there can be these really small specialty PSH units, maybe for, what did they say, like queer HIV men of color or something. And those can get specialty funding, and those can be like for safety and culture reasons, but for the most part, if you actually want something to be sustainable, you have to get a larger building. And that was really, I felt like, interesting to hear from, providers who were in the thick of it and they weren't trying to sell us anything. They were just, we've done this and this is our experience. And that is to say that you never can look up or Google some of these like unique specialty catered projects. But those are the exception, not the norm. Again, I think that one of the beauties of what I liked about the panels, it's always great to hear this information again when someone isn't trying to sell a project to you.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I
That's a good
sent the meeting to like 3 friends, and like, just learn from this. This was great, just learn.
Yeah,
So I thought the whole thing was just such a research heavy gift, so we should thank them again.
In
That's
fact,
good.
they've all been there, done that, and here's the best way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought they were very open, that's pretty helpful.
It's one of those topics where, like, you can do a lot of research, right? Or we did the, you know, in the case study research, and like, you can dig into a certain level. But until you actually like, are there experiencing day to day, how they operate, how the people you interact with, it is really tough to really get a sense. So I'm glad that we did the panel discussion to be able to get that feedback. Cool. I know we have folks on the phone. I don't want to forget anybody.
I just had a clarification question. When I was reading over the notes, it said something about overnight guests need to sign in, and I think that might have just been regular guests. I thought there weren't overnight guests allowed in PSH, but I might have misremembered that.
My
Okay.
understanding of that was that it depends on the project. So
Okay.
some may or may not have overnight guests. I can tell you that overnight guests, if they are allowed, are required to sign in. Some PSH require all guests to sign in. It really varies on the project. And I think that kind of it got a little muddled because they're talking about the vast variety of
Yeah,
projects. So
that
yeah.
makes sense.
That was my understanding too, Jen.
yeah. And some of that is related to medical care, of course. So there are different accommodations for, medical need. That
Yeah.
threshold. The other thing I really liked was, not just the good neighbor agreement and how these can be different from city to city. I think Buffalo has a really good one. But addendum in the lease agreement, you lock that in, so it's concrete, it's communicated, everyone has seen it, been, updated, it's a part of their onboarding, and they're gonna be advised through that entire process. They sign it, they initial it, it's good contracting.
And that's an excellent point, because that's one of the things that we've been bringing up is community nervousness over having projects, and the fact that everything is, they've got rental agreements in place, just like any multi-family housing, and
Mhm.
that's how you keep things, above board and change with the right tendency.
There's one thing I wish we could do as a group is be able to tour a few sites. I personally have had the opportunity, I know some other people have had the opportunity to either work in sites. But for parts of our group that have not had that eyes-on experience, a community ground level experience, I think it's really imperative to help guide the process. I don't know if that could be made by appointment, but there's a difference between, small, low-income family versus different levels of permanent supportive housing and how those work and how they also work together as a community.
Yeah, that's obviously outside the scope of what this is, but we'd have to, obviously Debbie and I can talk about what that could potentially look like. I know it's not within the scope of like what was
Oh, this,
recommended, yeah,
but
so,
it might be something that we could do by appointment for
yeah,
some people. I think it would help the group.
no, it's a good suggestion. We'll talk about that afterwards. Cool, well, thank you all, that was really good. I agree with, I think a lot of the intricacies, I liked some of the detail they got into regarding how some of these are so different, and because of that, right, where my brain goes is development standards and such things. A lot of times they require different things, like we talked about, Kenmore doesn't actually really have, they have kind of broader open space standards for multifamily, doesn't program it down to you need to have like a tot lot level, but how getting in that mindset of thinking about those things for a development that isn't anticipating to have children. Like placing that requirement is onerous on a developer who's already, going through needing to find funding and site and space a lot of work and then program that space to then add like a space that's not going to be used is something that we need to consider and figure out in variance processes for those sorts of things. So that was really helpful. And then again, on the good neighbor agreement, just the level of detail they went into in terms of how they talk with each of the folks right around the proposed development to get into that agreement is really good too. Cool. Well, we're going to jump into the recommendation memo. So like I mentioned, there's a couple of things that this committee has been charged with doing, which is potential development code amendments relating to step housing. We'll talk about this today. Currently, step housing is evaluated very similarly to how most multifamily projects are evaluated in the city. There's not a whole lot of separate detail in the code really at all for step housing projects. So we'll go through kind of how it gets evaluated now. If we think that there should be specifics relating to step housing projects, if we think that there should be a different process in terms of permitting processes or code. We'll talk about the draft good neighbor agreement, and then we'll talk about some potential outreach materials that could get prepared. Those are kind of the four components of this final recommendation memo that this committee then takes to council and presents. So looking just kind of at our scope wise when we look at that. Additionally, on top of that, we were talking a little bit just a minute or two ago about this committee also has an open house as part of the scope of this project. So I'm really curious, and I want to talk to this group at the end about what we think the best use of that open house is, because we kind of talked about two scenarios just briefly here. Is that more of an inform people about what the community has been doing and provide information about step housing? Or is it an engage of like, we want to get feedback from the community on step housing processes and that kind of stuff? So there's kind of a couple of, or it could be a combination of both. So there's a couple of different paths we could go down. Curious. Again, this wasn't overly prescribed in terms of what the community needed to do with these things. So a lot of that is in your hands in terms of what you all see as being most effective for the process. So we will cover that. So I mentioned currently this map's a little tough to see, but we can also get you a copy of it. Step housing, this is per HB 1220 and the requirements of where step housing needs to be permitted. Permanent supportive housing is in all the zones you see listed in all residential zones. If you just kind of look for transitional and permanent supportive at the orange in that map, it's a lot of the community, right? Because most of it's residential and it's permitted in all residential areas. Now, it still follows the same density requirements and those types of things. So you could have specialty ones that are smaller, less dense, couple unit type things, or you could have ones that are in, the downtown area that are bigger. It just depends. So it is very much treated like the residential development standards and follows the development standards for a typical multifamily project. So in that sense, it's not all that different. Emergency housing a little bit more limited. It's downtown commercial and it's urban corridor. There's a few other areas in there as well. But as I mentioned, they generally follow a lot of the same standards for typical development. So in that sense, when it gets evaluated as a project by the city, it's not all that different, right? Sometimes there are differences. I know in the Plymouth project, the reason it went to council as part of that process because it had development agreement. Development agreements are not required. It's just if you want to have some variations from the code, or if you want to set up separate agreements between the city and city wants to get some benefit from allowing a deviation from the standard or something like that. You can enter into those, but you don't have to. So currently that's not, again, a requirement of the process. So right now, when somebody proposes a step housing project, it gets evaluated like a multiple project. And so we're going to show some examples of a couple other nearby cities and things that they have in their code that the committee could consider. But you don't, again, they're not required. And in some cases, I'll cite some revised code of Washington sections that talk about these different things. So as we go through and we look at just some example development standards, so some cities have some conditions on development prohibiting the cluster of step housing. So having potentially, whether you call it buffering, whether you have like spatial requirements, things like that, they are allowed. And this is one of the ones where I'm going to quote the revised code of Washington. Reasonable occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use requirements may be imposed on step housing to protect public health and safety. So it is possible to have those things. Again, it becomes more restrictive because you need to allow it in each of these areas. And then you start to run into conflicts of, well, if you need to allow it in the zone, but you're also saying you can't have it within X amount of feet of another project, then it can quickly become very restrictive. And so,
They talked
again,
about that in the panel.
yeah,
Yeah, about how one of the very small PSH units or one of the very small projects was racing against a larger project.
mhm,
And it was kind of in this 4-person house or whatever it was. Seasonal, it was like a very small seasonal something, and it was racing against a very large project, and they're like, some of these buffering are really interfering with, that gets tricky.
yeah. So more and more, I think guidance is going away from having some of these buffers because they are kind of restricted. But again, it's just providing you all the information of what's in the revised code of Washington. It is linked to public, and again, it is a little bit vague, right? It's not super clear intentionally about guiding you one way or the other.
Sorry.
Yeah,
So is that something that we should know what the city's current guidelines, regulations are?
the city
Or
doesn't
makes
currently
suggestions
have, the city doesn't currently have any buffering standards relating to step housing and permits of order condition, yeah.
So you're
So-
planting ideas for us.
Yes.
I'm saying, these are things that other cities have done that are examples of, again, most cities very similarly process it like a multifamily project in that zone. So same requirements, that kind of thing. It's not like cities generally, and actually San Jose and Colorado is in this too. Cities don't generally have this like whole separate step housing section that like has all these code requirements. It's generally little things here and there, so. Then we've got some buffering and screening requirements. Some codes restrict support services to those living on site. That is interesting because if you think about the implications of it, right, you're not having people come from out of the other areas and going to that building for services.
Yeah.
It's meant to serve the people who are living on that property. Again, this is not a requirement. It's just something that some other cities are doing, looking at this experience. Training and security agreements for step development staff and residents. Those code requirements, putting those in place. Commerce recommends lowering parking minimums. We'd have to look at that in relation to a lot of the other recent city actions that reduce parking in certain areas when you're within a certain distance of major transit stops, or within a certain corridor. Like, there's already a lot of things that I think potentially lower parking standards, but you could also put something in place where if you anticipate, a particular population in a transitional housing project or a permanent supportive housing project is not likely to have as many personal vehicles, maybe. And I think generally this group probably knows parking is the most expensive things to build when you're a developer, and it usually sometimes they lease it separately, sometimes it's with the unit. It is just expensive to build, and it takes up space that could otherwise be a residential unit, or it could be something in a walkable area is not necessarily a car is not always needed, so. It's a recommendation of Commerce. Again, the allowed non-residential zones part, that's just for transitional permanent support housing, that's just a requirement, 1220, so. Some of the questions that I wanted to ask this group, or we wanted to ask this group were, just what are the biggest physical challenges you see facing step housing development? Because a lot of times when we talk about development standards, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about height requirements, we're talking about setbacks, we're talking about intensity standards, those types of things. We're even getting this detail, right? And these are some of the things that Kenmore's code doesn't have all this detail, but like about first floor heights for floor plates of like when you have a mixed use development, those types of things, or in this case, you have services on the bottom or something like that. How does that look different? So it's talking about open space requirements. It is talking about those types of things. So when you think about, you've drawn from your all's background in step housing, what are the biggest physical challenges or constraints that we could address through changes that maybe don't apply to a typical multifamily project? Any thoughts?
So with the past project, we have encouraged a community van to help with commuting people to appointments, and that's also one of those services that was recommended to be part of, a larger housing kind of development.
Mhm. So,
We are also.
Right on that really quickly, so if
Yeah.
if a development was to provide like a common vehicle with, let's say, like prescribed times that they would take people to the grocery store or take people to certain areas, would that be like a good trade-off for reduced parking for people that's maybe not necessarily needing a personal vehicle?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay.
We're also 2 suburbs outside of Seattle, and there's still a lot of people who haven't given up their cars. You'll see a lot of seniors hold on to the cars. You see a lot of that independence.
Yeah.
It's really important to people and families. It's a lifeline to employment and childcare, accessing community resources, emergency care. So thinking along those lines, I'm more supportive of in a family-like housing scenario of a secure parking garage, maybe with some reduction numbers. But I think, our community is pretty clear about roadside crowding, especially we're looking at downtown. And, you know, a sixth grader is not taller than the car. So as soon as you step off a curb and there's a series of cars lining the road, they're walking into traffic usually. And so we have to be wise to our community needs, you know, those navigating our community. So I would be in favor of a reduction in some parking, but I want to make sure that there is parking. And that we're not giving that up and crowding our streets. Bothell did not give up their roadside streets, for some of their housing that they've established. They recently adopted some policies, that now, don't require parking minimums. So we'll see some road crowding now, but in their past housing developments, they haven't had some of that.
What about in relation to, I know we talked about security and providers who were here on the panel mentioned that a lot of their facilities are secure. They have,
Mhm.
you know, locked entry doors, they have entry and sometimes gates and stuff like that. Those aren't current requirements in a code. But what do you all think about? And again, likely based on what we heard, there are things that for different providers would put in. But are those things that you would want to have? If not specifically, maybe referenced in terms of like increased safety measures relating to step housing for the benefit of residents or the benefit of people living in the facility and in neighbors, those types of things. Are there anything related to safety that you all can think of that would be appropriate for a development code?
I think when we're talking about permanent supportive housing, that those levels of security are really best standards. And when they design, these housing units, you have to be paged in a door, you know, and you have to stop by our front desk to enter that next door to visit a resident or provide health services to a resident. And you're probably going to have to get a different pass to go up and down an elevator. It's for ensuring the safety of the community and people who are going into housing for solutions are coming out of a number of unique life experiences that many people have not had to experience. And it's a process of recovery, it's a process of becoming healthy, and also ensuring that community safety within. And so I think that's important for the housed community, and I think that's important for our surrounding community. And it helps the staff provide that quality community they need for the residents as well.
I guess I'm confused on where that feedback would even fit, because that sounds like something that city staff or city council would use on like a metrics of who to decide to choose after like an RFP, not something that would go into like zoning or, you know, I'm thinking like, I thought we were
Yeah.
discussing zoning and suddenly we're talking about, well, let's make sure that like the key cards are the highest tech, and I'm
There
like,
is a different.
Yeah.
that feels like a very
Operational,
different
but
level. So
there
I
are-
just walk me through what we're discussing.
yeah, so
Does
we
that help
could,
catch up to me?
It's more contractual with executive level.
so there's like, there's an
Yeah, it's like-
operational,
Yeah.
there's an operational
Yeah,
component.
like how you.
There
pick
could be a
something.
separate agreement
Yeah,
relating to security. There are cities that put in codes, put in their codes,
or
different
zoning
security.
codes, or what is, like, I guess to be clear, like
Public health safety codes,
safety.
Yeah, so there's what is the concept?
wellness.
There's like a safety prevention, it's like an environmental safety prevention concept of like different design standards where you,
Okay,
for visibility purposes, you have like certain locked entries in certain areas, where you like limit access to the front door. And again, those are not common in some codes, but they could be something that is looked at as part of this overall project of saying like, we would like to have a couple primary entries and
can you
identify
show
for
us
the project.
examples of cities and how that looks? So if you, like, could you
Yeah.
pull it?
We'd have to
not like this minute.
Yeah, we
That
can
might
provide
be
it.
hard.
Yeah, we can provide a separate
I
part.
just, I mean,
They're more like design
The city
features.
does have,
Bellevue is a good example.
some of them could be design guidelines as well, or design standards as well, versus zoning code development.
don't wanna reinvent the wheel and accidentally do something discriminatory because of where we in it.
Yeah, no, we can definitely provide that.
Yeah.
Separately.
Caitlin has one thing.
Yeah, sorry, Caitlin.
Yeah, so I just want to be super clear. I'm getting an echo, but I want to make sure I understand. The step, I mean, it's outright permitted in anywhere we allow residential uses, which means that there's no reason it has to go through a development agreement. It could just, this is going through the same permitting process as somebody who wanted to like build an addition onto their house effectively, right? We're just applying for the city for a permit. So I think, Juliana, what you were saying is, my understanding is the reason that you want certain things in the code is because there isn't an additional process. There's no public hearing. This is just something that's between the landowner and the permit desk. Correct?
If this can be approved at the city manager, it's a type 1 process that can be approved at the city manager level. Like, doesn't ever need to go to a public hearing. It doesn't, again,
Okay.
because the development agreement's not required. So, correct.
Thank you,
Okay.
Kat.
And then just to follow up on that, with things like SROs coming through, that increases the density pretty substantially. So you would get wherever, you had 1 unit, SROs now allow like an SRO counts as a quarter of a unit. So you would, if you were previously allowed 6, then you would be allowed 24 SROs instead of 6 full dwelling units. I just want to make sure that, well, I want to make sure I understand how step is counted. Is it counted just like a regular dwelling unit in terms of density standards?
Right now, yeah, it is. I think it,
Okay,
in my experience, it relates back to the definition of a housing unit. Like SROs are typically like 1 bedroom and shared facilities. If it is its own unit with, say, its own bathroom and kitchen, I think the census has like a definition for.
yeah. So a dwelling unit is a 3-piece test, right? It's a kitchen, it's places for eating, sanitation, and
Yeah.
sleeping.
Mhm.
And an SRO can be sleeping and sanitation, but no kitchen. Kitchen has to be shared. Yeah, so I want to make sure that I understand what gets built based on the code if we do nothing, or what could conceivably be built based on the code if we just say, let her up, see what
Right.
happens.
So said a different way, does that mean that the yellow section of that, the max capacity would be 24 residents?
It depends on where you are, because that yellow section of the map had multiple, it was anywhere from R1 to R6. And
I
so-
can answer, I can answer that. The way that they did the middle housing amendments, you get a maximum of 3 units per lot, so it should be 12 SROs, I think, in any of those, right? If my math is right. You would have to short plat a lot in the R4 or R6 area in order to maximize the number of SRO units, but then they're detached. I don't know. It doesn't, or you do it through unit lot subdivision. So maybe.
Yeah, you could do more down to the base density for the zone, so depending on lot size.
When we get to the community piece, right, I mean, people will understand the purple downtown section, they'll care about the yellow section. So being super clear on like,
Yeah.
this is the maximum you could possibly have here is 12 units or 24 units or whatever it is. On the security stuff, I think you have to have that in there, or you want to acknowledge the risk that is the primary concern from the community. And then on the parking piece, like, given that we already have reduced parking requirements substantially in the community, and it's still a high concern of a lot of people, like, I can see a slight variance, but I don't think you can't come back with what happened with Plymouth, where it was like we had 100 units and 2 parking spots, or whatever. It was like that, you'll just lose credibility instantly with that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So,
Well, I think also with one of those things that you put just because the city doesn't have a parking requirement, doesn't mean that you're not allowing parking. You're having the developer pitch to you how much parking, right? And so you know, if you go back to some of these different projects, often like if council is saying we want reduced parking, we want parking, and then you partner with the developer, there's like, oh, we are a parking minimum developer, then you're gonna end up with like 12 units, right? But if you are a city, they're like, well, we value parking and we value walkability, and you get a developer that's like, oh, we also really value parking, and they can pitch to you, and you can still approve that, but it puts the pressure on the developer to use their money and to offer you multiple options of this is 60, this is how many units we could get with 60 spots, 30 spots, 20 spots. And so I personally like having that choice and having the developer use the free market and figure out how many, you know.
So,
So I personally like having less regulation on parking and having the person who, you know, having the market figure it out. But I'm with you that, you know, some of these people are gonna be wheelchair users, some of them are gonna be holding on to their cars, some of them are not ever gonna have had the, you know, equity to be drivers, some of them are going to be part of clubs where they get picked up often. I for sure want there to be a lot of like zone parking and like the short-term parking. But no, I want there to be lots of flexibility, and then that can be hashed out when we are actually doing RFPs with developers, and they can say, we are doing PSH housing. And most people here are going to be disabled seniors. And you know, versus this is gonna be PSH housing for maybe young veterans or DV people, you know, and there's, I don't know, I want there to be a lot of flexible, nimble options.
so I think one thing we could look at that I don't think is required currently is some cities will have a requirement for a parking plan that you put in place, and that is just for the developer to say, propose, this is how we're gonna approach parking, right? We have our parking standard, but also we have a parking plan here that says some portion of it's gonna be short term, it's gonna be the pickup drop off type area. Or those vans come through, it's gonna be, this is where our circulation works on site. If we're proposing to go, you know, use a variance or something to go under the parking standard, here's why we're doing that as part of this parking plan. So we could potentially look at examples of those and then say, as part of a step housing project, you can prepare a parking plan. You could go based off of what's currently allowed right now, minimum density, just like every other development, so it's not more restrictive. But you could also prepare a parking plan that gives some flexibility to say, well, you could also propose this other process and have that as an option.
And that's reduction, because I mean, we do have some, you know, with the parking ride, and we have some churches with some big empty lots, and I mean, part of me is thinking like, if they wanted to offer van services or you know, like valets and contract with parking rides, or I mean, there's a lot of creative options that I would love to hear discussed in parking plans, right? And also I think of, you know, if we are gonna have some of these smaller PSH things that are maybe tucked away in neighborhoods, I can see people thinking, is there gonna be parking in front of my house? What is that gonna look like? So yeah, I just want both a lot of flexibility and a lot of clear communication, because I think people don't like being surprised.
I think for buildings that are mixed use buildings, where there are business spaces, businesses want customer parking. So 2 spots is not going to make a business owner happy or satisfied in our downtown. That's something we also heard a need is a little bit more parking there. I don't think we can, you know, not meet that need, because we need to be good business partners. That relationship between business and city is really important. And housing. So I think together we could get there. I love the idea of zoning areas by sticker. It's definitely, you know, something that could happen now that we're being a little bit more dense as a city.
Except for Kenmore doesn't ticket.
Yeah.
Currently,
Rarely, they
yeah.
do, they put a lot of warnings, but
Yeah, it's
yeah.
basically only by like, if you have an abandoned vehicle and we're all complaining about some abandoned van by Safeway.
Yeah,
know?
you don't move it for 3 days kind of thing,
Yeah,
2 or 3
but
days.
no, I don't think that's usually how we're using our
Mhm.
police officers.
Yeah, okay. And really, we're talking in that instance about, because this can go in a lot of residential areas, like maybe that's the specific, but in general, I think most developers are gonna want permanent parking site, just how they typically look.
Yeah, I would love to see them
Okay.
build that in.
Okay, we talked a little bit about kind of building in some flexibility. Is there any other, are there any other areas where you can see building in a little bit of flexibility? Right now, again, in the current process, a developer could apply for a variance to, if, you know, a particular code standard was overly burdensome to their specific project, it would have to make the same findings that a normal project would make, that the variance should be granted, but it is a process currently. Separately, if there are specific topics like parking, through a parking plan, those types of things, we could call those out and make it, again, a little bit easier of a process. We could make the findings a little bit easier in terms of the standards need to get met, those types of things. Like, there's some flexibility we can build in. Or we can more or less leave a lot of the standards the way they are, and have, you know, development evaluated the same way right now, so.
It'd be nice if these buildings could be green, living buildings or LED. When we have elderly residents living in a large building, it's usually what 12 to 15 degrees hotter inside than it is outside. You're facing a lot of sunlight. We have vulnerable populations in a dense setting. That building would need high vac. They need cooling air to also not be placed in jeopardy. That's just an environmental standard that I think that we could request that be built in. It meets our city you know, combination goals with our community and businesses. And state environmental goals as well, county goals.
Yeah, some of that, I need to look at the city's existing design standards for what is currently required for like sustainable building.
Yeah,
And some of that's gonna bank off just building code standards for what we need to provide for any kind of development, regardless of the type, so. Okay,
I would just be interested in understanding what the clustering. Conditions look like in London and Redmond. And if the end recto here is gonna end up being smaller, more diverse options, then that would be a way to.
Have either of those cities hit their step housing goals?
I don't believe,
Those are like 20 years old.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
I don't
anywhere,
believe
I mean,
anywhere.
obviously, but like any,
I don't believe any
anywhere
city.
like close.
no.
Like,
I
do they
don't- I
have
don't think
anything
any
where they
city-
like Bothell where they don't have?
I think there's a single
Anything
city in the
else?
state that's even close.
But like the 20-year goals, so most plans were, comp plans are only recently passed, so
No,
that.
I mean, that's,
Measurement
but I
time,
mean,
I guess, you know, that there are, Commerce is going to be requiring, you know, reporting.
yeah,
So once those initial reports come out, I think it's like 5-year reporting
Yeah.
requirement. So after 5 years, and, you know, there'll be a big, you know, better picture of how cities are doing meeting those targets.
But if I could maybe like guess at where you were going, like. That, I don't think it's currently been an overly restrictive standard because there's still so few step housing developments around.
Yeah.
That I don't think like the buffering or having distance
Those are also
requirements currently an issue.
bigger city
Yeah,
geographically than we are, you know, we're,
yeah,
so.
I think we have to get over our size.
Well,
We're not as
usually I
big
am
as
until we're talking
Bellevue, we're
about
not as
literally
big as
buffering.
Seattle. I think we have to get over that mindset and just talk about the housing, because we have to move on the housing.
Yeah, I
And-
agree.
Also it's one of the things that can be helpful for EMS, and fire, police is, you know, create, building identification. Some buildings, there's so many of them popping up where you have, maybe just one side of the building that's listed. And you, as we're getting more dense in the different areas, can be very challenging to find a building. Or a building within a set of buildings. And making sure you're responding to the right location. I think that's important. And to make sure that location identification is on more than one side of the building.
okay, so signage and wayfinding and that kind of thing. I think it's typically how that's referenced.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, you know, like Bellevue has some advances, they also have had some difficulties in this area.
Mhm.
So.
Well, I do wanna, we're not gonna need to spend nearly as much time on the processes portion, but I do wanna move to that so we can kind of also talk about the good neighbor agreement afterwards as well, but, if you all have thoughts on this when you go home afterwards, if, we'll provide a few more materials based on the conversation we had here. If you have other thoughts on that, always feel free to send them over. Again, I don't think the intent is to do a wholesale overhaul of the code or anything like that. It's to look and see if there are ways that, step housing differs from, typical or multifamily housing that is either affordable or at AMI or above AMI or whatever it may be. And if those differences warrant some sort of change to the development standards. That's the overall approach here. We did want to talk a little bit about the process, and we kind of got into it already. It is a type 1 process. It is approved at the city manager level. There's no administrative appeal unless you need to go to a variance or conditional use permit for some reason. And there would be a lot of, deviation from standards would typically be those reasons. If you need to go to a variance, then it would go to type 2 and then be an administrative appeal process. We didn't put it on here, but you would go to a type 5 if you needed to do a development agreement, because I think development agreements need to go to city council. So that is the process in which they go to a public hearing. But otherwise, those,
Can you
these events-
clarify that for us?
yeah.
Just.
So, so a lot of
just
times,
clarify.
a lot of times when developers are looking for, and this is for any project, not just step housing, are looking for concessions or variation to a standard, the city will say, well, we want something in return as well. And so they will enter into a development agreement that is separate from their actual approval. A lot of times it gets approved at the same time, but it is a separate agreement between the city and that developer. And the conditions of that agreement can vary on a lot of things. It can be reduction of, setbacks, it can be increased height, it could be other standards and things. And the city will say, okay, if you're gonna do that, we want to increase the open space on the site, or we want, additional facilities or some other thing that is not currently required in the code. And so because it's an agreement outside of the typical standards that are established in the code, then it goes to a public hearing and planning commission, city council weigh in on the agreement. And because it's part of the project, the whole project ends up going to a public hearing process. So that's currently how it is. Again, if you stay within all the standards, then it's a type 1 process. So, yeah. So again, there's not a whole lot of modifications we could make to this, but I also wanted to cover and say, like, hey, this is the process. It's not like it can really be made, less restrictive. It's interesting. We were talking to development services staff in preparation for this meeting, and they were saying, the Plymouth Housing Project was actually, in terms of city review, was one of the quicker city reviews. It was obviously there's, the portions that had to go to council and those things that delayed it further, but there was not, it being a step housing project didn't create any issues on the review side for the city. It could be processed pretty quickly. So in that sense, it's not currently an overly burdensome process or anything like that. So I don't know there's a whole lot of deviation, but I did also just want to put it out to this group to see. We did the same thing of looking at other cities. Some cities require a narrative as a condition of approval, which is interesting. Why the site was chosen, how it complies, the security measures, those types of things that you might find in, well, some of those that you might find in a good neighbor agreement, those types of things. But I think it's interesting backstory. It's part of maybe an application process. I think this is, again, maybe me putting my personal thoughts out there, making it a condition of approval is interesting because it's kind of a subjective thing. Like, if you provide, well, it's objective if you provide the narrative or not, then the content of the narrative becomes kind of subjective. It's like, what standard are you trying to hit? So that becomes kind of difficult, but wanted to put that out there. And a lot of cities, similar than with Buren, just director approval level. It's not, doesn't go past basically staff. So
It serves a public good and a really critical way that's needed in our community. And every city is having to go through their process, right? But I know that we're always looking for something that can also contribute to the community. We're gonna probably see something like that. I think it's gonna be on the executive side of discussions and design and development. What I have concerns about and worries about is even though the state has made certain mandates and requirements, we have a reluctant council. And it's fair to say that. With other comments on the record on, middle housing, let alone deeply affordable housing and who are the people who need it. It's sad discussion to hear, but it's also the makers of the policy approval process at some other end. And I think part of the strategy has to be how we work with meeting them in the middle somewhere. My greatest concern is getting through this process and not making much advancement at that next level.
So I guess just really quickly, how do you see that as fitting into a recommendation for the final deliverable that we're like?
Yeah,
ultimately
I
the
think
method
we'll
that
make
gets conveyed to the
recommendations.
council, yeah.
and we'll definitely see what they do and what they don't do.
Okay.
I hope for the
Our job
best.
is to give recommendations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
just hope for the best. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So, when you had a point on the last slide about. Public notice,
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that.
what, I mean, this. Probably the most common refrain seen on any of these projects is, I had no idea,
Mhm.
so what is the? Public notice requirement, and is that the same
The
as to
posted
use,
sign,
to use Kalen's, if you like,
the published.
if I want to put a second story in my house and just put a sign up, is that the same thing as if I want to open up, yeah?
It's actually, I may need to clarify this with the volunteers, Debbie, I don't know if you know offhand what the noticing requirements are for just type 1 approval
A
projects.
type one's a building permit, so you don't typically put a notice out for a building permit. Someone's building a single family home. Or someone's putting an addition, something like that, then there's typically no, let's notify the public for a type 1 permit. If it's when you get in those higher levels, so like a short plat, a long plat, a variance, something like that, that's when you typically see the sign go up on the property. A mailer goes out to neighbors within a certain distance of the property. And that's typically what you see. If it's a city project, then again, that's something where there'd probably be more broader community outreach in terms of the city website, social media, newsletter, that kind of a thing. Or if it's a major project, then often that, and it's not a city project, same kind of thing, more goes out to the public. Beyond what is typically required for public notice, but yeah, for type 1, you're not gonna get a sign up there going, guess what, my neighbor's doing something on their site. So what we'd have to confirm, and we can confirm that, Nick, with development services, that if the step housing is a type 1 process, what kind of public notice would be? I think that's what Josh is
Yeah,
asking,
yeah.
just for confirmation.
Yeah, we'll confirm that with development services.
Obviously, I think many would be very concerned if there was a deviation of the code for building or encroaching upon environmentally sensitive areas. That's something that, of course, our
Yeah,
council and our community would like come up and uproar over. That's something I would not want to see any housing situation or a building
yeah, and I think there's
come
even,
through to.
That would tip
Yeah.
you into a higher level. of
Exactly.
permit
Those
review.
trees.
Exactly.
and I think there are sections on the revised code of Washington that also basically say like, some of these, just like we talked about a couple months ago, these don't apply in areas where you have some critical areas, sensitive areas, those types of things as well. Just say basically the city's critical areas ordinance would still apply for these types of developments as well. So now I don't know about the tree ordinance. That's a separate one.
Don't.
I mean,
That's
I'm not
a
gonna say-
long night.
I'm gonna say- Yeah.
Significant
Everyone
trees,
loves
don't-
trees. Our
don't
residents
touch
love
them.
trees.
One of the things we talked about, and I apologize, because I actually meant to ask Debbie, we received a couple of examples of good neighbor agreements from one of our presenters. And I meant to distribute them in this group, but the reason I didn't is because I wanted to make sure that they were fine with us sharing that with everyone. It wasn't just shared with the city, so assuming,
Sure, we got that
Yeah.
document.
okay. Then as soon as tomorrow when we get back in the office, we'll share those documents with you all, just so you can see an example of what it might look like. I think we have 2 examples, so. We'll make sure to share those. But really, currently Kenmore doesn't have a process for good neighbor agreements, so looking at the baseline. Of what, developing the process of one.
Debbie, has Mary's Place or any of the other shelters, have they ever had a good neighbor agreement?
No, there's no requirement right now for good neighbor agreements.
And like City Partners or Mary's Place, they haven't like offered one out of their own?
Let me check on
Okay.
cause that's a shelter requirement and
Right.
like a temporary shelter, so. Let me check on what those requirements are. I don't think it's called a good neighbor agreement, but let me check what those are, so we can also then be clear on the process and, any other requirements.
We can,
I'm not in the code as often as I used to be.
Give me homework, Debbie.
we did consider a good neighbor agreement with Plymouth at one time. But that I think was the first really public dive into what that looks like. I think it could be improved upon. So I look forward to seeing some other examples of that.
Yeah, and that is something, right, where you could make it a condition of approval for a project to enter into a good neighbor agreement if one was developed. In talking with our panel presenters or providers, it was fairly common practice from their experience, so it doesn't seem like it's an overly burdensome thing, and in fact, it seems like it in a lot of cases can help with the education about a project. It can help to ease maybe some community opposition you see and hopefully create the process, create assurances for residents and for people who are living in these said housing projects. So
It seems like you need the combo of the code of conduct and the good neighbor agreement.
Yeah.
Together to have something that stands up.
So we'll share examples, but just based on the conversations we've had, what are important things in the good neighbor agreement that you all would want to make sure that we consider in there?
I think there's a few right off the top. And no history of drug manufacturing. That was one of the things we considered
In the facility or?
in the good neighbor agreement, like not having a prior conviction of drug manufacturing. It's a real problem with abatement and issues.
I'll
So
have to double check. I don't know if good neighbor agreements cover
I think we should look at that.
resident history. I think it's more of a discussion of how when you were living there, the
But
interaction you have with surrounding properties, surrounding basically I would say it's neighbors of the property. It's like a code of conduct type thing. It's not necessarily like a prerequisite.
So there are two different things. A good neighbor agreement can be in a lease with addendums, and that's more to that community, and a good neighbor agreement to the outer community is different. So I want to make sure what we're talking about. You're talking
I think
about
we're
the
talking
business outer community.
Yeah, I think we're currently talking about agreements with the surrounding properties and neighbors of the property.
I think,
Because that's what we can control.
I think it'd be of interest to at least see what was presented to us with Plymouth for a good neighbor agreement. I think there's an example that exists that had gotten to, the council level of notice of potential action on. So it'd be worth it to pull it.
Yeah, that should be something we should be.
I don't know if there is one, I'll find out. I don't.
It was with the
exactly-
documents.
I don't know if there was one, so let me find out. I'm not.
There was.
We can get back. So we can get back on that one.
Yeah, I'll have to check.
And I was assuming we would come up with, here's a template we want,
Yeah,
those were, here's the items that we would like in it.
Yeah.
So some
Like yours.
changes back and forth.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this committee can go as far as putting a draft of one together and
It's
for
great.
council to ultimately approve and move items, add items, whatever it might be, but make recommendations on the, based on examples on the actual language as well, and not just like at a topic level.
So I just have a quick question in terms of good neighbor agreements and arguably on the basis of what this committee is doing and kind of the outputs of it and whatnot. I guess my general perspective is that a lot of things like the Good Neighbor Agreement and what we're putting out are the minimums. I've worked on contracts for a long time, and contracts are a minimum requirement always. That's what they are. And so I guess when I think about Good Neighbor Agreements and what should be in them, I would hope that we can have the mindset of what are the minimum requirements that we want for our step housing partners and whatnot, and allow space and flexibility for them to add in as appropriate for what they need. And that, I think, for goes to your point to saying, well, we can add this into the addendums and the agreements with the renters or whatnot. But I think it's one of those things that, we're looking to build, I think, potential opportunities for template agreements and contracts and understanding and all those things. And there will not be a one size fits all that's going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important that we allow for some flexibility, but also remember that the common denominator minimums are kind of what that to me is what is important. So it's one of those things where, like Karina, you were saying, like no history of drug manufacturing. I don't know that a good neighbor agreement is the place for that, but I do know that that is typically something that is oftentimes standard in the screening processes for this type of supportive housing and whatnot. So there are other places, and I don't think we should feel like we have to kind of catch everything, because we're just not going to be able to. But I would like to make sure that we're trying to create something that is applicable, no matter who the council is, no matter who the developer is, that we can still kind of get the minimums of what's important to us and what we want, that will help keep everybody feeling safe and confident and keep things transparent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking some of the standard things that we're hearing are, and thank you, Jen, that was really great. Understanding of hours of operations, understanding of points of contact was a really important thing. So if somebody does have a question, who should they call? Who should be the person that they reference questions to, versus just having no understanding, having basically no one to go to. A lot of those things felt like the very standard items that should be addressed in a Good Neighbor Agreement, right? If something, if somebody does something that's outside of the Good Neighbor Agreement, what is the then course of action after that? Like those things that place certain assurances as sort of standard. So those felt like the kind of things that we would draft into a Good Neighbor Agreement. So.
I just assumed broadly that because it's a Good Neighbor Agreement, there's some reciprocal in this. So say there's often common area, and say, it sounded like there's often cameras that are running. And say this common area sees that one of the residents does, graffiti or something violent to an actual neighbor, and that footage would be used to do the next steps. I assume that also if a neighbor did vandalism to the PSH property or did something violent to the resident, that would also be, the agreement would go both ways, right? That we would know, that, if you come on our property and you beat us up or you vandalize us, like, we are going to treat you in the same way we're gonna treat our own people, and we're gonna call the police, and we're gonna ban you from our
Yeah.
property, and we're gonna do all these things. And I think I don't know, I assume that the Good Neighbor Agreement is both a protection for the residents as well as the community, that it's a both way.
Yeah, I think
Guardrail.
that's how it's intended. I mean, I am curious how it works out in the language, because like in those scenarios that you enter into, regardless of,
I mean,
So-
we don't want this to happen, and
yeah,
I'm not
regardless
trying
of
to
step
assume that
housing,
that would happen.
yeah, step housing or not, like, you go onto anybody's property and you beat
Exactly.
them up, the police are gonna be called, like, there's gonna be that process that goes through. So a lot of that I think is standard city process, but some of this stuff is standard city process, and it still needs to be memorialized in this type of document. So that's actually a really good question.
And those are really rare things, because people are so happy to finally have secure housing, right?
Hate
But it's
crimes do
important to.
happen to vulnerable people.
Right, but it's why you make the planning, but they are rare, so, which is a good thing. I wouldn't want our community to think, well, this is, a constant perpetuate issue, but that's what the Good Neighbor Agreement's about, so it's good.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, I'm not trying to like perpetuate stigma, but more rather use an example of
Right.
that is protecting both sides.
The overall, yeah,
Right,
there's.
that we are not
a
making an
balance.
agreement assuming the worst in our neighbors or assuming the worst in our residents, but there's duality,
Right.
right?
No, it's a good.
That, you know, if we are assuming that we don't want the residents in their open area, that we don't want them, you know, getting high, we're also not having our
Yeah.
neighborhood kids like huddling there and getting high and, you know, being.
Yeah.
Whatever, so I think, yeah, I'm just thinking of the duality.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm curious for this group, one of the questions that are up here is. Right, there's not currently a process in place. Does this group think that good neighbor agreement should be a requirement or should this be a requirement or like a recommended best practice? Because if there's,
I think a good neighbor agreement is a highly useful tool. And we just need to evolve there as a city.
Caitlin, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, my experience with good neighbor agreements is a little bit different than Jen's. I've seen them in the short-term rental space, and I think the kind of basic idea behind it is to say to your neighbors, this is what is these are the rules that govern our behavior, right? Because it is different than a standard residential use in the neighborhood. And I think that when you replace, you know, what would be a long-term tenant or owner neighbor with something else, whether it's a short-term rental or, you know, a permanent supportive housing situation, there can be a lot of confusion about what they're allowed to and not allowed to do. And so just looking at our good neighbor agreement that I've seen for short-term rentals, and this is in another jurisdiction, it just lays out, you know, like, here's what the short-term rental operator is required to do. We're required to have trash cans and these are our quiet hours. And these are the things that, you know, we are doing that are not applicable to a normal single family or multifamily residence. And then we're, you know, ours, that is required to have a local contact. And so I think having the contact in there as well, so that you set both clear expectations for the members of the community. I think really, I kind of see the good neighbor agreement more as like a community outreach tool, where you're letting other people in the community know, here are the rules that we are playing by. Here's what you can do if you see that we have accidentally or on purpose, you know, not done that. This is your course of action, so that you're not getting complaints that are totally ridiculous, and so that people know what to expect.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all, Kate. I think that makes perfect sense. I think where I was coming from is within our role in this committee and potentially drafting a template or I don't know, a user's guide for good neighbor agreements. I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. And I think that's part of what we're trying to figure out. I think that makes perfect sense. And whether it's a short-term rental agreement or an SPH rental agreement or SROs or whatnot, I think that makes sense. But I also think that we have to allow flexibility because the same rules, you know, and maybe I'm wrong, but you know, if we have a primarily disabled senior housing type of supportive housing program come in, is that going to be the same good neighbor operational agreement type setup as what we would have for something else, you know, for a different type? And I would argue that for our purposes in this committee, maybe, because a general standard, like how in the weeds should we be getting? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think that allowing flexibility for those conversations to be had, and maybe it's putting out, you know, these are elements that you have to have in your good neighbor agreements. You have to have a contact person. You have to have basic rules about sanitation and, I don't know, general behavior of the residents or whatnot. I don't know. But I think that to me, it's important that we are mindful of our role on this committee versus being a developer or being in the other roles where they're the ones who have to carry this agreement out. I don't want our standards to be so high that it becomes a barrier, but I want to facilitate those conversations between the community and the developer and the city as needed. And I think that transparency is really important. I think that being able to say, this is who we're putting into these properties and these are the things that, you know, we think are important to keep the residents safe, but also keep the community comfortable is important as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there is the ability to create almost like a required items and they'd be very,
It's a minimums.
right, and
Yeah.
then you have these other items.
I would require that it has to be there. To Jen's point, have minimums that cover the big, you know. open
That's
road.
exactly what I'm saying. Yes, exactly.
Agreed.
This is like the bare bones stuff that
Yes.
you gotta cover.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We all want the same thing. I don't think there's any disagreement about that, right? We all are looking at the same bare bones, like what do we want? What's important to us? I think we heard that very clearly. And so I think that those using that as like the platform and the basis for these, that's great. And then the expectation that they're, you know, that the folks who are building or developing or running the project, they're going to take best practices into account and add in what they need to add in to bolster that good neighbor agreement so that it's appropriate for those projects. That would be my expectation. Now, how you put that into something like that, I don't know. But I think working with that mindset of what's most important to us that goes across all of STEP housing agreements that's kind of how I see what we should be looking at versus getting into the weeds with each individual project and trying to meet out, well, this one should have this, but this one doesn't need quite that, it should have this.
I think we can leave it flexible enough to be able to have those discussions on the time come, because we're, like you said, we're never gonna be able to forecast everything that will go into a project, it's just not gonna, so. I'm doing a horrible job of timekeeping. Someone mentioned community outreach, and I did want to talk about community outreach too, just for what projects they get proposed. I guess on two fronts. When somebody proposes a project, what information would you like to see be recommended that they provide? Is, you know, would you like to see a required community meeting? Sometimes, in some cities, when projects come forward, they require a community meeting for certain projects, and they say you have to come forward and present the project we were talking about. You have to receive feedback from the community and consider that feedback. On the other hand, there's also, you know, potentially things the city could do in terms of handouts or even, you know, put videos and workshops here, depending on staff time and availability, that could be informational materials that go out ahead of a project, not tied to any specific project, just as a resource to the community in general. Really want to hear a couple thoughts on those types of things, either developer-led or city-led. Is there anything y'all would like to see?
One thing I keep thinking about is how, you know, if one of my neighbors is having like a small home and just hosting a few like PSH, like, you know, if they're like a safe house or transitional housing for women fleeing domestic violence, and it's a very small group. Part of me just keeps thinking about how that feels like a very different discussion than a very tall building with 100 units, right? Like something where it's a small number of people versus a huge new development. Those just feel like, to me, very
Different
different discussions.
discussions,
Those
yeah.
feel like those feel like potentially different vulnerable populations.
And maybe.
I don't want to be, yeah, I don't want there to be barriers to people doing small PSH because they're like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to do like so many public meetings and so many things to do small PSH. You know, I need to be, so I think,
That's a good point.
So maybe we just set a minimum of,
you know,
the development's gonna be whatever, 25 units or more at that point.
Yeah.
We do it 20 hours.
I don't know, again, I'd be interested if there are
Maybe.
other cities that already do this or 50 or just, I don't know, I just.
Maybe a community announcement at that size. I think when it gets to be a bigger building, larger capacity,
Yeah,
that's when our community really wants to know. Places like Mary's Place, when we've had Mary Place, we want to know how they can help support, get involved, you know, that sort of thing. So, either a little public announcement and maybe a little city council public time, sharing what their project is and what they're doing and how people can engage is what people would like to do. We did hear from community a lot on Plymouth, and they just really wanted to have that earlier interaction with the organization. They had, I think, there are a number of things that could have been done differently. That was one big one. But there was a lot of activity leading up. It was also a time of exiting COVID. So people were everywhere else.
Yeah.
You know, everything was hitting last minute. But not in actuality. I mean, the city did an excellent job of really putting everything out there in advance and working with community. It's just that time in our history was a challenging time for families and, you know, businesses.
I think it's a great point for really any project, right? When you do early engagement, it feels much more meaningful for a participant, because when somebody comes in and says, I have a project fully designed and developed, I'm ready to build it tomorrow. Oh, by the way, give me your feedback. At that point, it feels like there's not much you can provide, but if you talk about early engagement before, at the time an application goes in or something like that, where you have an early concept, but it's still under review and there's still opportunities for changes, things like that. That does feel like an important distinction to make it for that early engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where like the public notice
Mhm.
process and, it's like, I totally agree with your point on that. Helping 3 people feels a lot different than building 100 unit building,
Yeah,
but it also, like, if those 3 people are violent felons that are just getting out of prison versus their 3 women fleeing domestic violence, right, as a neighbor, like, those are gonna hit very differently for me, so
That's valid.
the. I think it's the range of that or what, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
The level of risk associated,
I mean, I
but
think it
I
does,
mean, at a minimum, right, the 100 unit building affects the entire city. The 3 unit probably affects a block or 2,
Yeah.
right? So there's.
it is interesting, like, at some point, right, you're not gonna be able to dig in and address every scenario, so it does, but it does make, I mean, obviously.
They're like
that makes a lot of
threat.
sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Would you all be interested in the city doing, proactive materials or things? I mean, do you think that would be helpful for the community to learn about step housing?
I've always said
Through
more
information
communication is
materials,
better.
those sorts of things.
These kinds of
That
things.
housing generally.
Generally, like not tied to a specific project, just transitional housing or supportive housing, whatever it might be, through informational materials. I mean, even maybe if it's
Yeah.
just the city's website that they currently have.
Yes,
relaying
yes.
it to, okay.
I think people, I said this earlier, I think people like learning about things when they're, and not at the same time they're being sold something.
Mhm.
If they just get to learn, and I think. It's great to be able to learn about something, at the same time, you're not thinking, wait, is this gonna be my neighborhood? Is this gonna impact my traffic?
Yeah.
If you're just thinking, this might be coming to my community, and you're just gonna learning it about it pretty neutrally, I think that's
And
a
good,
great time to dive deep.
and good soundbite material too. I mean, you can go for that deep dive with links or, landing pages. But it does help our community connect to an issue, and understand things if there are infographics and sound bites.
Mhm.
And then give them a link to dive deeper into a situation and, or learn more. Because communication is more than just what we say or what goes on the page. The visuals do matter.
It's really a lot like the city. For the most part, it's pretty good about, oh, here's our sidewalk improvement project.
Yeah.
Here's our downtown project, or here's how the city's looking at, our step goals, here's what they are, here's why they come about, here's what our 10-year plan is and so forth.
Salmon Festival culverts, right? There was that. That was excellent communication.
Okay. Well, it's good to know. We will put together some recommendations on that as well.
Great.
Okay, and the last thing I have here is kind of tied to that, but it is,
With that.
yeah,
We're writing notes.
absolutely.
I know
Yeah.
that, Josh mentioned this a couple minutes ago, and I agree with him. what I think I would love on the city's website is where we. Like what we have currently, you know, what is step housing, and then what do we have in Kenmore that counts, right? We like city partners, then do we have anything else that hits any of these other buckets, or do we have any projects that we anticipate will hit? Cause I feel like that's a question that a lot of people are gonna ask. And, you know, we have these projects that have been approved, right? Or that people talk about, we talk about senior housing by Jay's Cafe, and we talk about housing right here by the car wash. And I think that a lot of people are wondering like, well, where is that gonna fit into any of this? Or is that gonna be something else? And so I think if we just had,
That's a really good
you
point.
know, if we had that linked in
Mhm.
of actually, we need even more, or some of this will be the same, that would just be really, I think, again, more education and outreach for our community.
Baltimore Planning Commission did a walking tour, and they had some
Yeah.
communication of what does certain kinds of housing types look like that were already existing, yet, you know, not codified in a way that they were starting to consider. And it was actually very helpful in understanding those different concepts. And very welcoming. You know, it had very much a grassroots kind of
Mhm.
ground zero community kind of feeling, you know, because you're gathering at City Hall and you're going out for a short walk and you're taking a look at these different buildings and how they're used, get a little update, just a little walking tour. That was amazing. I think something like that could be amazing for Kenmore. Yeah,
Yeah, we could-
it's so
we could look
easy
at
to replicate,
recommendations.
yeah,
Yeah, I can't commit, the
yeah, I know.
Kenmore planning conditions or anything like that, but, you know, we can make
Just
recommendations.
fall into open.
Oh, yeah, could be some great college volunteers or something.
Cool.
I feel like there was a graphic that we got when we first started, just with the numbers.
Yes.
Yeah,
Maybe if that's included in there or
Good point.
updated.
Yeah, I think some of that might be on the city's website already. Yeah,
Items sort of exist.
yeah.
Yeah,
but we
we
can take a look at
have
it.
our goals,
Yeah.
like for the
Yeah.
city, but I would love, yeah, if we just kind of updated it with,
Yeah,
yeah.
Good
with
point.
our
maybe
projects.
saying even just like a small description, because some people may not know, like, certain houses, or certain developments qualify as step housing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
I like how we're all on the same page.
Well, so the last thing, and again, I wanna make sure I don't go so far over that we completely pass our time, but the community open house is part of this. I guess I'm a little more curious to find out, because it shapes how we pull it together. I think timeline wise, it would make a lot of sense is if we took what we heard from here, drafted materials, brought it back to you all. You all had a chance to look at them, review, give comment, and then we went out and had the community meeting. And the community meeting or open house could be us presenting, you know, the committee and say us, presenting the sort of work that we've done. It could be soliciting feedback, from the community to get, for larger opinion. It's not prescribed in anywhere what that community open house needs to look like for sure, so I'm really curious to get this group's initial thoughts, and then you can always provide them separately about, if you want to go further in detail, just about the intent of that meeting and what you think would be the most beneficial.
So just tag it, but that would be September.
Yeah, I think that we were talking about that would be
We
September.
don't have a date right now, so I know Shannon sent out a poll to try and nail down an
August.
August date, which is where the draft.
I think we review the draft
Comes
information,
back, I'm guessing it's gonna be sort of latest September for
It
an
is,
open house,
yeah.
to give time to get public notice out and things like that.
It's always gonna be tough with school starting, with all the
Yeah.
things, the different conflicts that we're gonna have, but. I think, at this point, I don't say any kind of the year you run into that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, September, October, you get more engagement than August.
Yeah.
Nobody's secret.
Right?
Yeah.
Um,
And then the mad rush for September.
probably need at least one rev on. What do you bring back? I'm sure everything is.
Yeah,
I got no, and we'll have some comment here.
yeah, no, I'm sure, we
So-
fully expect there to be comments.
Is there something simple enough that could be at a farmer's market as a initial kind of breathe into it? To, you know, provide some information, gather some information from community.
We can, I guess what I don't know when the last farmer's market is, so I think once we nail down a date for an open house, we can, have information available if the market's still going on to sort of say, if you're interested in this, here's the open house, and you can have a QR code or something. We did something similar to that, for the park recreation open space open house. So if the market isn't there, then we can look at other opportunities to get the word out. But I think what we're really saying is we need to get the word out to get people to come to the open house.
Right.
It's not going to a farmer's market and being able to ask, what do you want? So I don't
Yeah.
think that timing's gonna work out.
Right,
But to your point, sort of an ease into
Yeah,
the,
To answer your question, I would think that we would want at least what our template is of the, a good neighbor agreement. And then what recommendations we bring back to the city.
Mhm.
Those couple of things I would think we would want to kind of have done.
and would you want to structure it to be able to receive feedback from the community, or is it more like an informational, here's what we've been putting together?
like you could
I
have,
think he should ask for feedback.
Yeah.
And that's kind of our goal here, but.
Yeah. like one of those things you could do is have different boards and different. Good neighbor agreement things and dots to stick next to, yeah, this is a good one, this is a good one. This is what I wanna see in a good neighbor agreement. Yeah, it's a good visual, and it's an easy thing to do, we give a list of dots. Yeah.
Yeah, I envision regardless of, the overall, the structure is gonna probably be informational upfront, open house, and you can circulate around to
Great.
those types of exercises where you are focused on development standards and processes, and then good neighbor agreements. and
Some
community outreach.
visuals,
Yep.
some visuals.
Yeah,
Great.
whiteboards, yeah,
Great, thank you so much. Food, I think events like these need to have food. It's really,
You might be able to go to snack.
we'll do the city on that.
well, it's,
That's why I watched the budget.
yeah, look at the market who we are also engaging and in our community. It does help people come. So, and it culturally responsible,
Okay, well, yeah, we will provide, typically what we do for open house is we provide sort of the structure of it and a quick write-up. The content overall, and you all can get feedback on if you think we need to add anything to it.
So we could effectively have materials that are draft that people would be reacting to.
Yeah,
great,
I mean, we probably would put them, we may generalize them a little bit more
Yeah.
on a board versus like. Handing over in text changes of the code, that's not as digestible as the overall topics, but yeah, like the thing.
Fun.
Yeah, it's always fun when you do red line versions of the code, so here you go. Take a look.
Would it be a standalone meeting or, it's gonna be an hour before the city council meeting?
I guess we hadn't talked about it, I
Um,
think we envisioned standalone, but I don't,
yeah, I think we'd envisioned a standalone, but that's an option. But if you're doing it before a council meeting, then I think you sort of in the 5 to 7 range, it might work. But sometimes it's better to kind of do timing a little bit later to allow folks to get back from,
yeah,
work and things like that. But we can look at options for dates and times. And
I mean, you did, I think the farmer's market ends in September, but there is the Oktoberfest.
yeah, so saying whatever event there is, we can-
September.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
20.
yeah.
Okay.
So.
And then, sorry, I'm backtracking,
Yeah.
the good neighbor agreement, is that something you guys are gonna take and try and pull from?
yeah, so we'll send over, yeah. Very first thing, when we get back to the office tomorrow, we'll send over the draft, ones that we've received, just as examples. And if there are things that stick out to you all, okay, I think this needs to be in the one we put together. You send that back to us so we can compile, but yeah, we will put together the draft, components of one and then bring that back, and so we can kind of discuss it there.
So we haven't done any really back and forth with the, like the email group that we're all on, but is that something that could be sent out ahead of time so we can all throw out ideas? Okay.
So I think we'll send the draft materials a week ahead of time. If we have them further than that, we can send further than that, but I think that's been our typical practice is if we do have anything to share, we send it out a week ahead of time, the agenda. With the hope that's enough time to be able to review. This is a little bit heavier ideally a little bit heavier of a content version, so if we can get it out earlier, that'd be great.
I would,
We'll try for that.
I'd also assume if we were providing some feedback, we'd be giving that to the clerk or to be bent. Because we wouldn't want to respond to all of us in a email, and create a
Exactly.
zero meeting.
Yeah, we can kind
Maybe
of,
say that
we can
tomorrow.
compile, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
all right.
well, thank you, everyone, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Jen, Kate on the phone, thank you for joining, really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you all. And we can end the meeting there,
Thank you so much.
thank you all.